There is a chair at the end of the attorney's conference table that my parents did not expect to be occupied. It is occupied. My grandfather is sitting in it. He is 81 years old, and 14 months ago my parents told every relative who asked that he was too fragile to travel, too confused to make decisions, too diminished to be involved in anything requiring his presence. The attorney has just finished reading a clause. My father has not looked at the chair once since we sat down. I have been watching him not look at it for 11 minutes. $1.2 million has been documented, traced, legally addressed. The word the attorney used was fiduciary. My mother wrote something on a notepad and then stopped writing. She has not looked at what she wrote. Someone called Adult Protective Services 14 months ago. My parents do not know who. The report is referenced in the document the attorney just read. There are things in that document my parents believed no longer existed. The neighborhood knew them as people who had sacrificed everything. The document told a different story, but to understand what happened in that room, you have to go back to the afternoon my parents made a promise in front of witnesses and meant none of it. My grandfather spent 41 years as a civil engineer. He designed drainage systems for 3 municipalities and never once talked about it at dinner unless someone asked. He was widowed when I was 9. And after my grandmother died, he became quieter in the way that people become quieter when the person who translated them to the world is gone. He remained sharp well into his late 70s. He did the crossword in pen. He remembered the date of every structural failure he had ever studied. His house smelled like linseed oil and old paper and something underneath both of those things. The specific smell of a place that has been inhabited carefully for a long time. The hallway floor creaked in the same spot for 30 years and he never fixed it. I think he liked knowing where people were. In the corner of his study stood a wooden drafting chair, solid oak, adjustable, scarred along the left armrest where a pencil had worn a groove over decades. He told me once, without particular drama, that he wanted to die sitting in it. I believed him. It was the kind of chair that meant something. He had $1.2 million in liquid assets and a paid house. This was not a secret, but it was not discussed. My parents had been struggling financially for 3 years before the conversation happened. My father knew the number. My mother had known it longer. The conversation happened on a Sunday in October. My parents sat down at Grandpa's kitchen table and made him a promise. He believed them completely. I was not there. I wish I had been. What Grandpa thought he was entering into was a dignified arrangement. He was 80 years old. His balance was becoming unreliable, and he had watched enough of his contemporaries disappear into facilities that smelled like disinfectant and managed schedules to know he did not want that. When my father sat across from him at the kitchen table and proposed that Grandpa move in with them, Grandpa heard something reasonable. Family, continuity, a son who was stepping up. The terms, as Grandpa understood them, full-time care, his room arranged exactly as he specified, and his drafting chair moved to the new house and placed by a window. My father would assume power of attorney to manage the finances. My mother would be added to 2 accounts to handle day-to-day expenses. In exchange, they would provide everything a facility would provide, and more, because they were family. A friend of Grandpa's was present that afternoon, a man named Gerald who had known my grandfather for 30 years. Grandpa, being the kind of man who documented things, wrote the terms out himself in his deliberate, architectural handwriting. All 3 signed it. Grandpa kept it in his Bible, between the pages he returned to most. What my parents had discussed privately the week before, I learned only later. The conversation at the kitchen table was not the first conversation. It was the second. The first one did not include Grandpa. The drafting chair was moved on a Tuesday. Grandpa watched them carry it in and said it looked right by the window. That was the last time I saw him say something and mean it without fear. 6 months after Grandpa moved in, the power of attorney was active, and the accounts had been reorganized. $340,000 moved from Grandpa's primary savings into a joint account held by my father. The transfer was dated March 7th. I know the date because I found the statement later. At the time, I knew nothing. A further $180,000 was transferred in 2 installments over the following 6 weeks, documented in the transaction records as household expenses for care. Those 2 installments paid off my parents' mortgage. I confirmed this through a property record search 14 months later. The mortgage had been taken out 9 years earlier. It was retired in April. The same spring, my grandfather moved his drafting chair into their spare room. Grandpa's investment account, valued at $680,000, remained intact. My father had restricted access to himself alone. To relatives who asked how they were managing, my parents said they had taken a significant financial hit to do the right thing. Several people told me how admirable that was. I learned none of this in March or April. What I learned came later, and it started with a single comment Grandpa made during a phone call in July. He mentioned, without emphasis, that he had not received his monthly investment statement. He assumed it was a postal issue. He seemed only mildly curious. I noted it. It was the monthly statement comment that made me start keeping my own records. What I found over the next 4 months changed. Everything I thought I understood about my family, I did not confront anyone yet. I opened a notebook. I wrote down dates, amounts, and exact words. I did not know then that I was building something. I thought I was just trying to understand. Grandpa had a mild stroke in September. My parents called to tell me after he had been discharged, not before or during. They said it had been minor, that he was recovering well, that the doctor had recommended reduced stimulation and a structured routine. I was not given the doctor's name. My birthday visit that November was canceled. The rescheduled date in December was canceled also. My calls went unreturned for stretches of 4 and 5 days. When I did reach Grandpa, his voice had a quality I had not heard before. Careful, as though he were choosing each word with awareness of the walls around him. He was still coherent. He was not free. The study door was closed the afternoon I arrived unannounced in January. Through the hallway, I could no longer see the drafting chair. The caregiver, a woman who did not offer her name, told me Grandpa was sleeping. It was 2:14 in the afternoon. Grandpa had not taken a nap at 2 p.m. In the 81 years I was aware of him being alive, I was listed as his emergency contact. I had been removed from the care communication chain without being told. During one brief call he managed alone. Grandpa said something that did not fit the story. My parents were telling anyone who asked. He said quietly, "They said I asked for this." He did not ask for this. I knew his voice well enough to hear the difference between a man who has chosen something and a man who has been told he chose it. I requested a meeting. I used that word specifically as meeting because I wanted them to understand I was not coming for a conversation. I had obtained 3 months of bank statements during a brief visit when Grandpa and I were briefly unsupervised. He had handed them to me without my asking, the way someone hands over something they have been waiting to give. I printed them at a library and brought them in a manila folder. I laid out 3 things. The mortgage payoff, $180,000 documented as household care expenses, across 2 transfers in March and April, a $24,000 cash withdrawal on June 3rd with no corresponding care record, receipt or documented purpose, 2 additional transfers to a personal account held solely by my mother, totaling $38,000 between May and August. My father said every dollar had been used for Grandpa's care. He did not look at the statements while he said it. My mother said I was being destructive and that this was what happened when someone stood outside a situation and pretended to understand it. Neither of them addressed a single specific figure. 2 days later, my mother sent a text. 12 words. "You need to drop this if you want to stay in this family." I did not respond. I screenshotted it and added it to the notebook. Words were not going to be enough. I had understood that the moment my mother typed those 12 words and pressed send, so I stopped talking and made an appointment instead. My cousin called me on a Thursday morning to tell me Grandpa had been moved. My parents had not called. The facility was 40 minutes away. A Medicaid-eligible care home, the kind with a common room television and a schedule, posted on a laminated sheet by the entrance. Grandpa had $1.2 million in documented assets. He was placed in a shared room with one window. I drove there 2 days later. The intake paperwork, which a staff member showed me because I was listed as emergency contact, was dated 8 days prior. The stated reason for placement: his needs had exceeded what the family could provide at home. There was no medical directive attached. No physician had recommended the transfer in writing. His room held a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a chair that was not his. I looked for the drafting chair in every corner of the room before I asked. He watched me look. When I asked where it was, he smoothed the bedsheet with one hand and said they had told him there was no room for it. He looked at the window when he said it, not at me. Before I left, he reached for my wrist and said something quietly, the way you say things when you are aware of thin walls. What Grandpa said to me that afternoon is the reason I am telling you this story. He said, I thought family meant something different. I did not cry on the drive home. I had 14 months of notes in a notebook, a screenshot of a text message, and one statement from a man who had trusted the wrong people. That was enough to start. The elder law attorney had requested Grandpa's original estate documents as a matter of procedure. I was sitting across from her on a Wednesday morning in February, coffee going cold on the edge of her desk, when she set a photocopied document in front of me and uncapped her pen. The document was unremarkable in appearance. Double-sided, stapled once, the kind of paperwork that looks like it was designed to be ignored. The attorney pointed to Clause 6C without preamble. I read it once, then twice, then a third time, because the third time was when I understood it completely. 18 months before my parents sat down at Grandpa's kitchen table, before the power of attorney, before the account transfers, before the mortgage payoff, Grandpa had executed an amendment to his trust. The amendment contained a clawback clause. Any assets transferred out of the estate by an agent holding power of attorney were required to be returned in full if the grantor was subsequently placed in a care facility. The trust named an independent successor trustee, not my father, not my mother, someone Grandpa had chosen and never mentioned. The attorney said the trust had been executed 18 months prior. I did the calculation quietly. It was the same month Grandpa moved the drafting chair into his study and told me he wanted things in order. He had been in order all along. My parents had signed a power of attorney over a document they had never read completely. Clause 6C had been there the entire time. The clock it described had already started. The attorney filed a petition under the state elder financial abuse statute on a Thursday morning. I was not present for the filing. She called me afterward and told me it was done in the same tone she might use to confirm a scheduled appointment. The independent trustee was formally activated that same week. His first action was to issue a demand letter under Clause 6C of the trust amendment. The letter identified $520,000 in traceable transfers and the mortgage payoff, the joint account consolidation, the $24,000 cash withdrawal, and the personal account transfers, and required full restitution to the estate within 60 days or the matter would proceed to civil litigation. The letter was sent by certified mail. Adult Protective Services had already opened a file. Grandpa's facility physician had filed an independent report 6 weeks earlier. Before I had spoken to anyone, I had not known about it until the attorney mentioned it as a matter of existing record. I said nothing to my parents. They were telling relatives they were working on finding Grandpa better care. They thought the hardest conversation was still ahead of them. It wasn't. It was already decided. They had no idea the 60-day window had already opened. I went to see Grandpa every Thursday. I brought his favorite biscuits and we sat by the window. He never asked me what I was doing. I think somehow he already knew. The meeting was called a trust administration proceeding. My parents arrived in the same car, which I noted because they had not done that in some time. They were dressed carefully. My mother carried a leather portfolio she did not open. Grandpa was already seated when they walked in. The facility had arranged transport. He sat at the head of the table in a chair the trustees' office had sourced for the occasion. Not his drafting chair, but a chair with arms, positioned where a man who had built things for 40 years had every right to sit. My father stopped when he saw him, just for a moment. Then he sat down and looked at the window. The trustee read the trust instrument in full. When he reached clause 6C, he did not slow down or emphasize it. He read it the way the document was written, plainly, without theater. The demand letter was placed on the table. $520,000, 60 days for restitution. The house, which my parents had begun renovating in January, was confirmed as an estate asset. My mother's hands went flat on the table. My father continued looking at the window. Grandpa looked at nothing in particular. I counted 13 seconds of silence. If you have ever watched someone take everything from a person who only ever trusted them, and then call it caregiving, you already know exactly what those 13 seconds felt like. My parents asked for time to respond. The trustee told them the 60-day window was the time to respond. It had closed 4 days earlier. My parents retained an attorney within the week. It did not change the outcome. The trust amendment had been executed 18 months before the power of attorney was signed. The transfers were therefore made by an agent, operating under a document that postdated the clawback provision the clause held. Their attorney confirmed this in writing to the trustee within 30 days, which was the only useful thing that correspondence accomplished. $520,000 was returned to the estate in 2 installments. The first came at month 3, the second at month 6. The house was formally assessed and retained as an estate asset. My parents vacated within 90 days of the proceeding. The renovation they had begun in January was left unfinished. Relatives who had spoken publicly about my parents' sacrifice went quiet. Not one of them called me. I did not expect them to. When I told Grandpa that things had been sorted out, he nodded once and asked a single question. He did not ask about the money. He did not ask about my parents. He asked whether he could have his chair back in a room with better light. That was the whole story, in one sentence. We found him a room with a south-facing window. He said it was exactly right. I think my grandfather always knew what exactly right looked like. He just needed someone to make sure it was protected. 6 months later, on a Saturday morning in October, I visited my grandfather at his new facility. It is privately funded. The estate covers it comfortably. The independent trustee administers everything according to the instrument. Grandpa executed with quiet precision 18 months before anyone thought to take advantage of him. The drafting chair is by the south window. Solid oak, adjustable. The left armrest worn smooth where the pencil groove had been deepened by decades. It had been located in my parents' storage during the asset assessment and returned as personal property of the estate. It is exactly where Grandpa asked for it to be. He was sitting in it when I arrived. Not working, not reading, just sitting, the way a person sits in a place that has always belonged to them and finally knows it. My parents and I do not speak. I have stopped describing that as a loss. It is a boundary with a legal structure underneath it, and it holds without effort. Grandpa did not look up immediately when I came in. He was watching the light come through the south window, the way it moves in October, slow and particular. He told me once that good engineering means building something that holds without anyone having to keep holding it. I think he built this. I just helped read the plans.